Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is David Lepofsky, and I'm co-chair of the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee, which is sponsoring this afternoon's event. Delighted to have everybody here, and looking forward to spending the next hour together. Who is the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee, and what are we here for? Well, we are a coalition, nonprofit, non-funded, volunteer, nonpartisan, of people with disabilities, people without disabilities, and community organizations that are concerned about the rights of people with disabilities. And we're a coalition that's come together across Ontario, from one end of this province to the other, from all walks of life, from all social strata, from from a wide range of ethnic groups, basically from everywhere. And we've come together with one mission. We're united to achieve a barrier-free society in the province of Ontario for people with disabilities. We formed about 4 years ago, and we've been growing extremely fast across the province ever since. We've launched community groups in 10 communities across Ontario, with more to come. Well, what are we looking for, and why are we here? We're looking for a new law which we call the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, a new law which would have as its goal the achievement of a barrier-free Ontario for people with disabilities. It's a law that would require the barriers we now face to be removed, and the barriers that are being created now in the future to be prevented before they even happen. We entered the past 3 years in a really exciting situation where we had a government that had promised during the last election, in writing to us, that if elected, it would enact the Ontarians with Disabilities Act within its first term, that it would devote new resources, new money, to accommodate the needs of people with disabilities, and that it would work together with our coalition to develop this new law. We were excited a year ago when both opposition parties joined with the government to pass a unanimous resolution calling on the government to keep its promise. In other words, we were beyond politics. We were now in the situation where all parties agreed that we need this new law and that to develop it, the government should work together with us. We've been very busy ever since. Ever since, we've been busy reaching out to the community, reaching out to people with disabilities, all disabilities from across the province, to learn about the barriers they face so that we can make sure that an Ontarians with Disabilities Act will be strong and effective and will address all of those barriers. We've done the most aggressive and comprehensive survey of those barriers that any community group has ever done in Ontario. And we've come to Queen's Park today to deliver the results of that work to the three political parties represented in the Ontario Legislature. It is the legislature that must pass this law, and so it is to the legislature we will present our brief. And we've invited all three political parties to come here to receive it. We've not released it to the public until they have received it, because it is they who should properly receive it first. Well, this new document we call a blueprint for the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, because it's just that. It explains the barriers we face. It explains why we can't live in a province that's full of barriers. It explains why Ontario can't afford to have these barriers any longer. And it provides a blueprint on how a new law could remove them. This is only the first stage in the development of the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. What is needed now is the next important stage. It is necessary that the government immediately embark on a broad, open, public consultation across this province so that people with disabilities can express not to us, but to the government itself, to the politicians who have to draft these laws and vote on them, so that they can learn about the barriers we face, so that people with disabilities, whether they had the chance to have their say up till now or not, whether they were able to get to one of the public forums we held in 10 communities in Ontario or not, so that they get a chance to speak directly to the politicians who serve the public, who pass laws in this province. That is what is needed next. Well, we were excited when all of this began, and we're excited to be here today to deliver this product, but we're also frustrated. We're frustrated because 3 years into the government's term, the Ontarians with Disabilities Act has not yet been passed. It's not been introduced into the legislature for debate. It's not even been written. A public consultation on the Ontarians with Disabilities Act has not yet been commenced. There is no discussion paper yet from the government to even get that consultation going. We've decided that we can't wait any longer. We've decided that if the government is not prepared to release their discussion paper, we are going to release ours. And that's what we're here for today. In delivering this paper to the leaders or to the representatives of those political parties who've chosen to come today, we will be calling on them to embark on a public consultation on the Ontarians with Disabilities Act and inviting them to use our blueprint as the basis for the discussion. But before we get to that formal delivery of the brief, that formal presentation, we thought that it would be helpful to present to you and to the representatives of the political parties who've accepted our invitation and to present through the media to the public a bit of the reality that we're talking about. We're talking about barriers that affect real live people with disabilities, that affect you and me if you have a disability today, and if you don't have a disability today, they will affect you later in your life because it's only natural that most people experience a disability at some time in their life. So we've wanted to come forward with some examples of real life people who have to face real life barriers that an Ontarians with Disabilities Act should fix, and that would not be facing those barriers today if the Ontarians with Disabilities Act had already been passed into law. So to present that, I'd like to call upon one of our active members and a member of our legal team that does the legal work for the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee, Patty Bregman, to come up to replace me in this chair and to lead us through a presentation of some of the real barriers that we learned about through our outreach and that the government should be learning about when they commence their public consultations. Patty?
Chris, you need to join me. One of the things that the realities is it sometimes takes a couple of minutes to get things organized. We have one more person joining us up here. We know that all of you think about barriers from time to time, and I think the barrier most people seem to think about most often are buildings and ramps. What we're going to try and do today is give you a little different picture of barriers that people face in the same kinds of activities all of you do on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to talk about areas which are so fundamental to our lives. We're going to talk about education, access to recreation services, healthcare, and transportation. And we're not talking about theory, we're not talking about law. What we want to talk about and help you to understand is the real life barriers that the four people who've generously agreed to assist us today have come to talk about. We need to make it clear these clearly are not the only barriers, these are clearly not the only disabilities affected, but we thought we would choose ones that you could identify so that next time you go and do these same activities, that maybe in the back of your mind you begin to think about and look at the barriers and realize why it's so important that we have an Ontarians with Disabilities Act now, not 3 years from now, but now. For the last 3 years, these people have lived with barriers that needn't have existed. We're going to start by introducing you to Greg Kontaxis, and I will hand a mic to him. Greg is a young... I don't know how they... Sorry, Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how old you are?
Well, I'm 21 years old, and I finished high school, but with a lot of hard time.
Now, I was going to say, I mean, you've got your basic level high school degree. You graduated. Did you decide that you wanted more education?
Yes, I decided I wanted more education to prove my skills and to prove myself as a person.
And what happened when you tried to go back to school?
Well, what happened is that the school that I went to wasn't very well equipped for me. By that I mean that there wasn't enough people to help me write my questions or answers down.
And when you found that you couldn't get that education, how did it make you feel about yourself and about your future?
It made me feel very low self-esteem because I'm a disabled person and I deserve a life like normal people.
Did you try and go to college, you know, as an alternative to the education?
Yes, I did. And I'm in the waiting list for college for 3 years, and that still is not working out.
And what were you going to do with your education?
I was gonna be a reporter like you guys, but unfortunately, it will take me some time to work on it.
Thank you very much for sharing your story. I think you can see that the kind of barriers that Greg faced, had they not been there, meant that he actually could probably be working more effectively, participating in society. This isn't just theory for Greg. This is real life and has a real impact on his future. I thought we'd go next to deal a little bit with recreation, which is so important to all of us. And Jennifer Ritchie, who's here, is the parent of a 12-year-old son with a disability. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your son.
Sure. My son Kellen is 12 years old and he has cerebral palsy. He is quadriplegic and nonverbal and requires one-on-one assistance in all activities of daily living. So my husband and I very early on decided that we had basically two goals for him. One was to integrate him as much as possible into society and to allow him to achieve, I guess, the gift of reading so that he could be taken outside himself.
And have you tried to take him, I mean, most of us when we have kids, you know, want to go to the public library to learn how to read. Have you been able to use the library for him?
Well, when you can get into a library that is accessible, normally because Kellen does not have the head control that you or I do, but he is bright and is in a regular grade 6 classroom, we can't find large print books that deal with his age level, adolescent books. There's books for seniors that are large print and very juvenile books.
What about going out to play? I mean, the normal things 12-year-old boys do. Does he like to go to the skating rink? You know, are you able to take him skating or to playgrounds?
That's another good question. He loves sports activities and would love to participate. Most skating rinks are not accessible, and if they are, a lot of times I guess nobody's consulted with parents of children in wheelchairs because they can't see above the boards or whatever. And also, I found it very discouraging when my son was younger because we went to the playground and most of the playground equipment is not accessible, so he had to more or less be a spectator, and that's very discouraging.
I mean, how do you feel as a parent when every time you turn around there's a new barrier that you have to fight against?
Well, it really wears you down. It's stress on top of stress, and we need people to understand without our having to tell them and constantly advocate.
It's hard, and I mean, if you think about it, the Ontario government has been announcing a lot of new expenditures for, you know, education, and they're going to renovate schools and put in computers. We haven't heard anything about making sure that those renovations are barrier-free for kids like Jennifer's son. And we need legislation that will ensure that when they're building these new playgrounds, they're building them so kids with disabilities can play, that they can go to skating rinks. Next one we're going to move on to is health care. Many of you may remember the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in Eldridge that came down last fall. That was a case coming out of British Columbia where two people who were deaf had sued the government saying that they were not able to get sign language interpreters in the healthcare system. Supreme Court, in a very significant landmark decision, was very clear. The government has an obligation to ensure that there's effective communication in the healthcare system for people who are deaf. That was 6 months ago. The Supreme Court gave the government 6 months. The Ontario government has done nothing, has no plans at the moment to do anything, and there are barriers we're still facing. And I want to introduce Chris Knopik, who is Vice President of the Canadian Association of the Deaf and the Ontario Association of the Deaf, and ask him to tell us a little bit about what it's like in his own life when he goes to healthcare settings.
Well, I can give you one example. This happened fairly recently. It was last week. My grandmother took ill with a heart attack, and I needed to take her to the hospital. It's a small town up north, and when I went into the hospital, there was no communication, and I asked for an interpreter. And unfortunately, the hospital didn't understand what an interpreter was, and they said, well, we might have some people who can sign here, but they didn't. And I told them they needed to get in touch with the Canadian Hearing Society, who provide interpreters, and that we'd be able to get one fairly quickly. But that didn't work out because they refused to pay for the interpreter. So in my experience, this happens across the board to deaf people everywhere. And there's another person I can think of who is in a psychiatric hospital, needs to use their hands to communicate, went to a nurse, had a miscommunication happen, a fight broke out, the nurse restrained the person's hands so they were not able to communicate. How could the person tell the nurse that all they wanted was something to eat? So this kind of misunderstanding creates such barriers.
And are you getting a lot of calls?
Families who live here in Ontario, if they visit their parents in hospital, if they have parents who are in long-term care, they have sons or daughters wanting to visit them, the doctors won't allow the children to be in the room because they are deaf, and the parents do know some sign and can communicate with their children, but that kind of attitude presents a real barrier. So I think that the Eldridge decision is a very good one, the provision of interpreters, but we see ourselves still fighting the same battle, and it seems that society is not accepting of this reality. So a question we need to pose back to people is, when are we to be allowed to be on the same footing as other hearing people, as deaf people? Are we going to have to wait another 30 or 40 years?
As I say, do you feel frustrated that we've got the courts, but we still haven't gotten the result that we were promised?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We had a huge celebration thinking this was it. Tomorrow, the world is going to be a better place for us. And we understand that it takes time. Process always takes time. But it seems that there are attitudes that are still in place. You can educate hospitals. You can tell them that the court has made this decision. But there's always the dodge of, we don't have the funding for this. So then you can put forward to the government that hospitals need special funding for this specific area. But you get mixed messages regardless of where you go. So it seems the deaf people are left in the middle holding the ball, and we need somebody to fix the system to make sure that access is provided, rather than making us get bounced around in this system that doesn't provide us with access. This can be very emotionally trying for families. They're going to hospital, people are facing serious medical situations. Why do they need to go through this on top of whatever situation is arising? If I look at hearing people, they're provided with wonderful access. Why is that not something that can be provided for deaf people?
Yeah, thank you. One of the concerns is that we need to not rely on each person having to go to court. The Ontario government and the Supreme Court said, go and sue your doctor if they don't provide the interpreter, go to the hospital. This isn't effective. And Ontarians with Disabilities Act would provide the framework which would ensure that everybody has equal access to health care, not by having to go to court, going to the Human Rights Commission, but simply as a matter of process. And finally, I want to introduce Chris Portelli. And Chris comes from Mississauga, the infamous 905 region. Chris, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Well, I'm 27 years old. I'm a freelance graphic designer in Mississauga. I do get work when I can. It is a frustration because lack of funding for an attendant. I am not able to get out and work as regular designers do.
Now, I know that you have, and you're one of the fortunate people who can afford to have a van, but are there occasions when you use public transit or your friends use public transit to come and visit you? and you can't get on the transit?
That's for sure. The buses are not equipped with wheelchair standards, so it's impossible to get onto them.
I mean, are you able to sort of at the last minute call up a friend and say, meet me down at a restaurant for dinner?
No, everything is programmed. There's no spontaneity whatsoever if a task or an outing is wanting to be done.
Now, some of you may remember that under the previous government, there was a policy in place that all new buses had to be low-floor buses, which are buses that can kneel down and people wheel on. Very recently, this government has given exemptions to 3 transit systems from having to buy low-floor accessible buses, which of course means that we're going to have higher costs in the long run. I mean, how do you feel when you heard that Mississauga is one of the municipalities that got this exemption, that suddenly their bus fleet is not going to be made more accessible?
Well, I feel that this government is neglecting part of its voting population. And I feel that it's a blatant neglect, because something can be done about it and should be done about it.
I mean, in your day-to-day life, have you ever thought about how many barriers you face going into buildings and transit and
Within a day, there's thousands of barriers. Too many to mention. One inch steps are like a mountain to deal with in a wheelchair. You need flat ground, sidewalks that have the curbs lowered, but again, have the 1 inch steps. It's not acceptable. If you're going to do a job, do it right the first time. I think that the government needs to look at all these aspects and put an ODA in place.
Okay, I want to thank everybody. I think you can see from these examples, and you'll have an opportunity to talk to them more informally later, as well as a number of people who are in the audience. But I mean, I think as we hear the constant slogan of Ontario being open for business, we don't see them being open for people with disabilities quite as effectively right now. We think an Ontarians with Disabilities Act is a really critical factor in that process. So I'm now going to turn it back to David Lepofsky to make the formal presentation of our brief, and then he'll be available for questions up here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. David? I have to go now.
You have to go around, Chris.
The mic is in place. Thanks to Patty, and thanks to all of us who are, all of our colleagues who've joined us up here. As we went from city to city and got together with folks with disabilities and just asked them about the barriers they faced, in meeting after meeting, we heard story after story that is as frustrating, as unfair, as inhuman, put bluntly, as cruel as the stories that we've just heard today. People who want to get access to health care, to education, to jobs, to public transit, heck, just to be able to go to a park, and facing barriers in all of these locations. Well, you might think, how can we deal with this? One thing is to list a bunch of problems. Do we have a constructive suggestion? Well, we've been working for 3 years on that, and today, in unveiling our brief, we both unveil a broad list of the barriers we learned about, but also a blueprint for action, a practical framework for how an Ontarians with Disabilities Act could tackle the barriers we now face and prevent new ones, and could do so in a manner which is fair, fast, effective, and cost-effective. We ultimately want to save the province money. We want to save the province money by getting people with disabilities off of welfare and into jobs, to getting them wherever possible onto an accessible public transit facility so that we can have to rely less on parallel transit facilities. But it isn't just a matter of money. We talk too much about money. We want to do this not only because it's cost effective, but because it's plain, simple justice. No one out there benefits from the barriers we face. No one out there likes the barriers we face. No one out there wants us to face barriers. What we really just need is the political will of a government and a legislature that says, enough, things have got to change. And that's what we're unveiling today. As I said before, this is not the consultation process itself, because people with disabilities have come to talk to us so far. The public consultation process that we need is one where people with disabilities can speak directly to the members of the legislature and to the government that they have elected and who will draft and pass this law. We provide this brief as a blueprint to start that process and to get it going. We believe that a public consultation must start now. We believe that it must be held across Ontario. We believe it must be open, not secret, public, not private. We believe that it must be accessible to people with disabilities in the various regions of this province. We believe that it is important that the people that we consult with, the people we get to speak to, are the elected politicians themselves. We've had enough of private consultants. We've had enough of getting to talk to public servants. This is not the time to talk to them. They don't vote in the legislature. The members of the legislature do. So from our perspective, for a public consultation to be fair and effective, we must be consulting directly with elected members of the legislature. It is they, frankly, who have so much to learn about the experience that we have, that we've talked about here, and that so many have told us about, and that we've documented in our brief. So where do we go from here? We will release the brief today. We will provide it to any party that has, we told the parties the ground rules, which is if each of the parties wants to receive it, they must send an elected MPP here to receive it. That's part of the consultation process. We're not delivering it to people's offices today. We're not giving it to messengers. They've got to show their commitment by coming here today and now. But from here, the important next step is tomorrow. Tomorrow is the speech from the throne. That's when the government proclaims its upcoming agenda. We know the Premier has been going across the province asking at least some people, certainly hasn't asked us, but has been asking some people what should be his priorities now. What new things should the government be doing? Well, we've got one big important promise from the last election in writing, which has not even been started, much less has it been kept. If the government is going to be true to its promise, it's got to announce a plan for the Ontarians with Disabilities Act to be developed in the throne speech tomorrow, and it must announce the public consultation as quickly as possible. Certainly, if we don't hear about it in the throne speech tomorrow, and if the throne speech really is the blueprint for the latter part of this government's term, what clearer signal could there be to us as the 17% of the Ontario public who have disabilities that this promise is going to be left behind? We hope certainly to hear about it tomorrow, and we'll have something to say about it if we don't. But our message today is exactly what Patty Bregman said before. Premier Harris has declared that Ontario is open for business. We'd like the Premier to declare Ontario open for people with disabilities too. And that's why the title of our brief is Making Ontario Open for People with Disabilities, a blueprint for the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. With that, what I'd like to do is to identify which political parties have sent representatives and who will be coming up. We've made it clear to them that we don't intend to put them on the spot and grill them on the brief. They haven't read it yet. They haven't seen it yet. It's been given to nobody except the people within the ODA Committee who've been involved in it up till now. And then we'd like to present it to them officially. Could I ask who will be receiving the brief from the Ontario Liberal Party?
Gilles Morin.
Gilles Morin. Who will be receiving it for the New Democratic Party?
Howard Hampton and Francis Link.
Great. And is there anybody here from the Progressive Conservative Party as an MPP? I don't see anyone. Well, I can express the frustration of members of the ODA Committee and the community we represent that the government did not see fit to send anyone to even receive a copy of our brief today. I can express that I'm sure many will conclude that that symbolizes a lack of commitment. We will certainly be watching the throne speech tomorrow to see if we are right or if we are wrong, if that's the conclusion we draw today. Could I please ask the members, both from the Liberal and the NDP, to come up to receive a copy of the brief? Patty?
I've got
Here, I'll take the
Braille ones.
Yeah, the Braille ones first. Just to show that there's a certain weight to our position. Folks can decide who gets it first. Here's one copy.
Here you go, Howard.
There you go. Thank you. And Gilles?
That'll be here, David.
Here you
Thank
go.
you.
Now, ordinarily what I would do for the TV audience is to ask our colleagues here to open it and read it to us. But they'll probably tell you that they just got a copy in Braille, not in print. To assist them, we also have print copies here. Now you know what it's like every time I go to a meeting. And I go get one in print, or in Braille, I just get one in print. Can I just have the last copy? I can just hold this up. This is the copy that we would have given to Mike Harris or to one of his cabinet members or caucus members had they been here today, and we're sorry that they're not here to receive it. Anyway, I'd like to thank you all for bringing these, for coming to receive these. Gives you a little reading for tonight. This document contains the voice of people from across Ontario explaining exactly what our lives are like in a province full of barriers and seeking real action to change it. We want to thank you for coming, and we welcome questions. We don't propose to put our friends, our colleagues from the legislature on the spot, but we from the ODA Committee will welcome questions from the press if you have any at this time. Thanks very much.
Well, David, I want to, on behalf of, as a Liberal critic for the disabled, and also on behalf of my leader, who couldn't make it on time, I want to thank you for kick-starting discussions that should have been held a long time ago. And I can assure you that with the Liberal Party, this report would be held in high esteem and would be discussed also very seriously.
Thank you very much.
David, as critic, I'll let my leader speak for himself. He is here.
Well, David, I note especially page 43 of your report, words versus action, the Ontario government's record. And I think that will make very interesting reading. My sense is we're going to hear a throne speech tomorrow, which again will be full of promises on healthcare and education. But I'm afraid many of the promises will again be very empty. So it's reports like these that bring back the focus, that help people to understand what's really happening in Ontario, that healthcare and education and support for communities and support for the efforts that you're putting forward are in fact decreasing, not increasing. And I want to thank you for getting that message out loud and clear.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming. Let's now, you can take a seat, if I may. And if we have any questions, we can take a couple of minutes from the press if there are any questions.
It's Margaret Philp from the Globe. This morning.
Right.
I was interested in some of the stories that you presented here, and I have two little ones at home, and I was listening to Jennifer's story about having an accessible playground for her kids. Now, when my 2-year-old climbs the bars in the playground, I go into conniptions. And I was trying to imagine how a playground, if you could go into more specifics, how a playground can be adapted to a child you said he was a quadriplegic.
Yes.
So he doesn't have the use of his arms or his
That's
legs.
right. That's right.
So
That's a very good question. On a very specific level, if you can have a wide platform that will allow a wheelchair to go up, and if there could be some things like steering wheels that could be accessed by a child in a wheelchair that they could play with, things at a level for someone sitting in a chair, basically. And I can't answer all of your specific concerns. All I can say is I certainly broke my back taking my son down through those tunnels, and I would have done it continuously, but we have to think about the long term, and I only have one back. So I think you really need some consultation with families that have children with disabilities to come up with solutions that are both good for able-bodied children and good for the physically handicapped.
If I can just add to that, this is an example of where the Ontarians with Disabilities Act would make such a positive difference. The question is, what steps could we take to make parks and playgrounds more accessible to kids with disabilities? Well, that question applies to communities right across this province. Right now, what's happening is moms and dads are confronting the exact same kind of barriers we're now talking about here. And right now, municipalities would be left to figure out the answer on their own, if they bother even looking at it. The Ontarians with Disabilities Act on our blueprint would firstly require municipalities to do something about it, to look and see where the barriers are, and to plan to change, to make improvements to address them. But what it would also do is provide a vehicle for families and kids with disabilities themselves to express their views of what would make a difference, and so that can be taken into account as part of the planning. See, if you build a playground in a barrier-free way today, it doesn't cost any more for the most part, but then you don't have to fight these battles tomorrow or spend any money fixing it.
Do you imagine the ODA to be something like what the employment equity legislation looked like, where you've got targets and municipalities are held to establish ways that they can make their services more accessible? I mean, I'm very, not having read the report,
Right.
I'm in the dark.
I'll turn you to Chapter 2, which will give you more details on the framework for the legislation that we're proposing. And we do not in it propose, for example, hiring targets, as were found in the Employment Equity Act. But what we are proposing are a number of measures, one of which is to require government agencies and major organizations, such as a municipality, to develop a barrier-free plan, to look for where the barriers are now, to develop strategies to prevent barriers before they're even created, and to also develop a plan for, in an orderly way, consistent with reasonable resources, to remove the barriers they now have, so that there will be, you see, the important point here that we make over and over again, both in our brief and in discussions like this, is that it is foolish to think that these things are going to improve just by leaving it to governments or private bodies to do this voluntarily. The government or whoever built the playground that you were talking about before voluntarily created barriers. They don't, it's not that they're out to hurt anybody, but they voluntarily, under their own voluntary equal opportunity plan, this is what we ended up with. The government of Ontario, since '95, its only action in this area was to proclaim an equal opportunity plan, and the most of that is involved is a website and nothing more. And the philosophical underpinnings of their policy has been to have a voluntary approach to removing the barriers we face. Well, I can tell you that the people with disabilities in this room and the people with disabilities whose voices are heard in this document here and that we've talked to know full well that voluntary measures are a joke. They will not solve our problems. And that's why we've got a blueprint in here for a legislation that will require the changes to be made in a reasonable way, but will require them to be made.
And what's the enforcement mechanism?
The question is, what is the enforcement mechanism? We've looked at several proposals and we're open to more. Our basic principle is the enforcement mechanism should be effective, should be inexpensive as much as possible, should be fair, and should be fast. We do not want people to have to do what they do now, which is every time you run into a barrier, go file a human rights complaint and litigate for the next 2, 3, 5 or more years before you can get some redress from that barrier. We need that kind of backup, but that's not our prime method of enforcement. Our first level of enforcement is self-enforcement. That is to say, We would like to see major government departments, municipalities, and other major organizations have to develop their own plan, a barrier-free plan, where they can look within themselves, see where they have barriers, and develop a strategy for removing them. At the practical level, most people don't address this because most people don't even think about it. We want a legislation that will have them turn their attention to this. And but we also are looking at enforcement through the possibility of having regulations made, which could set standards, clear standards, reasonable standards, to address, for example, standards for accessible public transit, or standards for accessible education, or standards for something as simple as an accessible park and playground. So that once those and perhaps to provide as well timelines, reasonable timelines to achieve those goals. What that will do is it will tell those who are responsible for playgrounds or schools or public transit what should be done and when it should be done by, and to develop those regulations after getting input from us and from those who have to comply with them. Those kinds of steps let us spend our time solving problems rather than litigating over problems. We'll need litigation as a backup if people don't live up to these expectations, but we're trying to find a way that's new and more effective. I mean, we've learned from the example that Chris Kanopek told us about, that while the Charter of Rights is very important for us, look what happens. A woman wants to fight over the right to a deaf woman has to go to court over the right to have a sign interpreter present when she's delivering her baby in the hospital. The Supreme Court decides she has that right, but only it took 6 years. The kids were 6 years old by the time we knew that she had a right to a sign interpreter while they were being born. And even then, months later, from what Chris Kanopek has told us about, governments are still not complying. We need an enforcement mechanism that works better than that. Other questions? Questions from anybody?
I'll ask another one.
Sure, go ahead.
Again, this is getting a little more specific. It was for Greg. I was curious about.
I can't hear you.
Okay, so I'll speak up. I'm curious to know what school you were trying to get into, what school you're on the waiting list for now, and why it is you've been on a waiting list for 3 years. I missed a connection in that story.
Before we get to that, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to suggest that because this session is being videotaped, and before we put Greg on the spot, what I'm going to ask is perhaps if the two of you could talk about it afterwards. I just don't want to put people on the spot to give out names of schools if it's a matter of some personal significance to them, so that maybe the two of you can chat about that after. Is that fair?
And then I can put it in the Globe and Mail so everyone can read it tomorrow, you mean?
Well, if he wants to.
Okay.
That's up to him.
Let me give you my permission now. Yes,
Okay,
you
sure.
can
Go ahead.
put it in the paper, but I will not comment in here.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. That's fair. All right. Well, I'd like to conclude then by thanking everybody for coming down here. We're at a turning point. We're at a turning point because we've done what we can do. We've reached out to the community. We've developed a blueprint. We've brought it to the government. We've presented it here to those who wish to receive it. The real question will be in large part answered tomorrow. If we hear nothing in the throne speech about the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, I dare say that it's a pretty strong message about whether the government intends to keep its commitment, and it's a strong suggestion that it does not. We've been asking the government to speak with us since they were elected. Premier Harris has refused since he was elected to meet with us, even though in his letter promising us this legislation, he promised to work together with us. We call on the Premier to break his radio silence and to meet with us so we can get this process kick-started. We want to work together with the government, and we look forward to that starting